What if everything you fought for, everything you loved, was slowly slipping away? Jake Carter sat in a cold, sterile courtroom, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the collar of his shirt. His eyes darted around the room, trying to avoid the piercing gaze of his ex-wife, Sarah. The tension in the air was suffocating. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, sat at the front of the room, preparing to call the case. It was only the beginning, but Jake could already feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind raced, but his heart was a battlefield. His kids. Emily, his 10-year-old daughter, and Liam, his 7-year-old son. They were his world, and right now, they were at the center of a tug-of-war he never wanted to be part of. The divorce had been painful enough, but now, standing on the precipice of losing them, Jake felt like he was losing a part of himself. The thought was unbearable. Jake had never imagined he'd be here, in this position. Not in a million years. When he and Sarah first married, it had all seemed so perfect. They were a team, a family. But as the years went on, cracks began to form, small at first, then larger, until they couldn't be ignored any longer. The fight for custody had begun almost as a formality, a bitter afterthought. Now, it was his reality. "Mr. Carter, are you prepared to proceed?" The judge's voice broke through Jake's thoughts. It was sharp, authoritative. Jake blinked, pulling himself back into the present. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper as he answered, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge gave a curt nod and motioned for Sarah's lawyer to begin. Jake clenched his jaw, fighting the surge of panic that threatened to rise in his chest. He had to focus. For his kids. Sarah's lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Robert Ellis, stood up, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the court with a practiced, confident tone. "Your Honor, we're here today to establish that my client, Mrs. Carter, is the more stable and capable parent for the children. Mr. Carter, despite his best efforts, has shown a pattern of unstable behavior, and we believe that the children would be better off in the care of their mother." Jake's heart sank at the words. Unstable behavior. The accusation was like a slap across the face. Sure, his life had been turned upside down since the divorce. Who wouldn't be a little unstable after losing the family he had built? But to hear those words in a courtroom, in front of a judge, felt like the ultimate betrayal. It was as if the last shred of control he had was slipping through his fingers. He looked over at Sarah, sitting there with her arms folded, her expression cold. She didn't seem affected by the words at all, as if this was just another part of the game. To her, it was strategy. To him, it was his life. The judge nodded slowly, scribbling notes in his book. "Mr. Carter, your response." Jake felt his mouth dry up. His lawyer, Lisa Matthews, nudged him, a small gesture to remind him to stay calm. Jake stood up, trying to shake off the panic gnawing at his insides. I don't know what to say," he started, the words coming out haltingly. "I've been through a lot, Your Honor. My whole life's been turned upside down, but that doesn't mean I'm not trying. I love my kids. I've always been there for them, and I will continue to be. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make it right." Jake paused, looking at his children's empty seats across the room, imagining them there. It took everything in him to keep his voice steady. "I'm not perfect," he said, a lump forming in his throat. "But I will do whatever it takes to be there for them. I just want them to know that their father loves them. And that I'll always be there when they need me." For a moment, the room was silent. Jake's words hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. The judge, his face unreadable, made a few more notes before glancing up. "We'll take a short recess before we continue. Mr. Carter, please remain here." Jake sat back down, his mind racing. Had he said the right thing? Was it enough? He glanced at Sarah again, who now looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. A wave of dread washed over him. What if she was right? What if he wasn't enough? What if, in the end, he lost everything? The recess felt like an eternity. Jake couldn't focus. His thoughts were consumed with the image of Emily and Liam. They were only kids. They didn't deserve any of this. They deserved better. Finally, the recess ended, and the proceedings resumed. Sarah's lawyer wasted no time, diving into more legal tactics designed to undermine Jake's credibility. With each passing word, Jake felt smaller and smaller, as if he were being buried under the weight of it all. But then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Carter, the judge's voice cut through the chaos. Do you have any additional evidence to present? Jake's mind went blank for a second. Evidence? What evidence? The only thing he had was his heart, and how could you prove something like that in a courtroom? But then he remembered. The letter. Liam. His son had written it a few weeks ago, during one of their visits. It had been an unexpected moment, a small, quiet thing that he hadn't known he needed. But now, it felt like his only hope. Jake reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the folded paper. This, he said, his voice gaining strength. This is from my son. He handed the letter to his lawyer, who passed it to the judge. The room went silent as the judge unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. But in those few lines, Jake saw everything he needed to see. Dear Dad. I love you. Please don't stop fighting for us. We want to stay with you. You're the best dad in the world. Love, Liam. Jake's eyes burned as he relived the moment he read it for the first time. It had been so simple, but it meant everything. The judge looked up, his expression softening for just a moment. Thank you, Mr. Carter, he said, his voice quieter now. I will take this into consideration. Jake sat down, the weight of the world still pressing on his shoulders, but for the first time that day, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was only starting. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake Carter had always considered himself a simple man. He grew up in a small town just outside of Portland, Oregon. His parents, both hardworking and loving, taught him early on the value of perseverance, loyalty, and family. He learned to fish with his dad on weekends, and his mom's cooking filled the house with warmth and love. He had always imagined his life would follow a similar path, a steady job, a family, and a home to call his own. But life, as it often does, had a way of surprising him. The first time he laid eyes on Sarah, it felt like fate. She had been a new hire at the marketing firm where Jake worked, and from the moment he saw her in the office kitchen, a simple smile exchanged over the coffee machine, something inside him shifted. She was beautiful, more than that, though, there was something about her warmth, her laugh, the way she seemed to make the world feel just a little bit lighter. Jake was drawn to her immediately. Within weeks, they were inseparable. They moved fast. Too fast, maybe. After just 6 months of dating, Jake proposed. They bought a small house in the suburbs. The first few years were filled with laughter, late-night talks, and dreams about their future, about the children they'd have, the vacations they'd take, the life they'd build. For a while, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. But marriage wasn't as easy as they'd both expected. As the years passed, they found themselves growing apart rather than together. Sarah had always been the more ambitious one, focusing on her career and climbing the corporate ladder. Jake, on the other hand, had grown content with his job as a project manager at a local construction company. The difference in their aspirations began to show. Jake felt it first when Sarah started working longer hours. He'd come home from work to find her buried in her laptop, emails and reports scattered across the dining table. Her once warm smile turned into a tired, distracted look that Jake didn't know how to fix. He tried to talk to her, but she was always too busy or too tired to have a real conversation. Then came Emily. The pregnancy had been a blessing, a beacon of hope that the marriage could be saved. But even her arrival didn't stop the drifting. If anything, it made things more complicated. Sarah's focus shifted entirely to their newborn, and Jake found himself doing more and more around the house, trying to fill the role of both husband and father. He didn't mind. He loved Emily more than anything. But the cracks continued to widen. A second child, Liam, came 2 years later, and with him, even more pressure. Jake tried to be the perfect dad, but Sarah's emotional distance only grew. She became more frustrated, more critical, and Jake couldn't help but feel like he was failing her. He couldn't understand what had changed. What had gone wrong? There was a particular night that stood out in his memory, the night he realized that the marriage might be over. They had just put Emily and Liam to bed, and Jake sat down at the kitchen table, trying to talk to Sarah. He had hoped it would be a normal conversation about their struggles, their feelings. But when he brought up the topic of counseling, her response had been sharp, almost venomous. "I don't need counseling, Jake. What I need is a break. From this, from you." It was like a slap in the face. She had never said anything like that before, and the weight of her words left him speechless. They argued for hours after that. Accusations were thrown, words were said that couldn't be taken back. That was the night everything changed. The months that followed were a blur. The tension was unbearable. Jake tried everything, counseling, apologies, late-night heart-to-hearts, but nothing worked. Sarah seemed more distant with each passing day, and eventually, she moved out. The divorce papers came shortly after, and Jake found himself facing the harsh reality: his family was falling apart. As the legal proceedings dragged on, Jake's thoughts often returned to that night, the night when everything came to a head. Had he missed the signs? Had he failed to notice how unhappy Sarah was? He wondered, in those quiet moments, if there was anything he could have done differently. But those thoughts only led to more pain. He was left with the memories of what once was, and the empty feeling of knowing he might never get that back. The worst part was, he never expected to lose his children in the process. That wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to be his anchor, his reason for everything. And yet, here he was, fighting for them in a courtroom, a place he never thought he'd find himself. As Jake sat in the courtroom now, the weight of his memories seemed to press against him more than ever. He remembered the good times, the days when the world felt like it was spinning perfectly, when everything made sense. He remembered holding Emily and Liam in his arms, feeling like nothing could tear them apart. But life had a way of testing everything. "Mr. Carter," the judge's voice broke into his thoughts again. "Do you have any witnesses to call?" Jake stood up, his heart thumping loudly in his chest. He had nothing but his words and his love for his children. Was that enough? Would it be enough to save them? As the court continued, Jake's mind raced. He thought of Emily's laugh, the way Liam always wanted to climb on his shoulders when they went to the park. The bond they shared was unbreakable, wasn't it? He couldn't lose that. He wouldn't. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let Sarah, or anyone, take his kids from him. He'd lost enough already. The real battle was just beginning. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and the constant weight of anxiety pressing down on Jake's chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily and Liam's faces, their trusting eyes full of love, and he was filled with a new kind of resolve. No matter what, he couldn't let them slip away. Jake had always prided himself on being a patient man. Growing up, he had learned the art of waiting, whether it was for the fish to bite or for the right moment to speak. But this wasn't the same. This was a battle for his children's future, and it was moving faster than he could process. Each time Sarah's lawyer, Robert Ellis, stood up in court, Jake felt the sting of every accusation, every little jab aimed at his character. The first few days of the trial were exhausting. Lisa Matthews, his attorney, was doing everything she could, but the evidence didn't seem to be on their side. Every piece of Sarah's testimony painted Jake as the lesser parent. She was the stable one, the career-driven mother who could provide a better life for the children. Jake's sporadic work schedule, his emotional struggles, even his personal history, everything was on the table. "Mr. Carter, can you explain why you missed your daughter's last recital?" Ellis's voice rang out during cross-examination, his tone mocking and sharp. Jake's stomach twisted. He had missed Emily's recital, but not for the reasons Ellis was implying. It wasn't because he didn't care, it was because he had been working late, trying to finish a project that had been delayed for weeks. "Your Honor," Jake began, his voice tight, "I was working. I didn't want to miss it, but my job, sometimes it demands more than I can give. But that doesn't mean I don't care about my daughter's life." Ellis didn't let him finish. "And yet, she still had to perform without you there. What kind of father would let that happen?" The words stung like daggers, and Jake's hands clenched into fists. He had always been there for Emily, he just couldn't always be in two places at once. And yet, here he was, being painted as the villain. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Jake's mind reeled as the trial continued. Each moment felt like a slow march toward a place he didn't want to go. But what hurt the most wasn't the accusations or the tense legal battles, it was the way Sarah seemed to have become a stranger. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had shared dreams with, now sat on the other side of the courtroom, looking at him with cold indifference. She wasn't just fighting for custody, she was fighting to erase him from their lives. She didn't even look at him when the judge called for a recess. Sarah didn't need to. She was confident. She was winning. And in that confidence, Jake saw something that made his stomach churn. She had already made up her mind. She wanted to take their children from him, and she would stop at nothing to do it. The thought hit him like a ton of bricks. This was more than a legal battle. This was war. Jake had known that divorce was going to be hard. He had known that fighting for custody wouldn't be easy. But this was different. This wasn't just about who could provide a better home for their kids. It was about who could control their future. Who could hold the power. And right now, Sarah had all the cards. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a glass of whiskey that he hadn't touched yet, Jake couldn't help but feel the isolation creeping in. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The kids weren't there. The silence was deafening. He had never felt more alone in his life. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Lisa. "We need to prepare for tomorrow. Ellis is going to bring up your past issues with alcohol. He'll paint you as unstable. We need to be ready to counteract that." Jake stared at the message for a long moment. He knew what Lisa meant. His past had been far from perfect. After his father's death, Jake had gone through a rough patch, dealing with grief in ways he wasn't proud of. There were nights when he drowned his sorrow in a bottle, not realizing how deeply it affected his relationships. But he had worked hard to overcome that part of himself. He hadn't touched a drink in over a year. But that didn't matter to Sarah or her lawyer. They would use his past against him. Could he really win this? The thought made him feel small, helpless. He thought about Liam, his little boy, who used to climb into his lap every morning, asking for one more story before school. He thought about Emily, whose face would light up when he picked her up from school. She had always been his biggest cheerleader, her bright smile like a beacon in the darkest days. They were his everything. Suddenly, Jake's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was an incoming call. He looked at the screen, hesitating for a second before answering. "Dad, it's me, Liam." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from his son in a couple of days. He had been worried. "Liam, buddy," Jake said, his voice softer than usual. "How are you doing? How's school?" "I'm okay," Liam said, his voice small and tentative. "But I need to tell you something." Jake's stomach dropped. He knew something was wrong. "What's going on, kiddo?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could hear his son taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I don't want to go with Mom anymore. I want to stay with you." Jake froze. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Liam," his voice faltered. "Buddy, what do you mean?" "I don't want to go to her house anymore. I like it better with you. Please don't let her take me." Jake's throat tightened, his chest heavy with emotion. This was it. The thing he had been fighting for, the thing he had been dreading, his son was telling him exactly what he needed to hear. "I won't let her take you, Liam. I promise you, I won't." For the first time in days, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. The conflict between him and Sarah had reached a boiling point, but this moment, this small, unexpected call from Liam, gave him the strength he needed to keep going. There was no going back now. The battle was on, and Jake was ready for whatever came next. Jake had spent years building his life around the belief that everything would work out, that he could solve any problem with enough effort and heart. But now, as the trial continued and tensions rose, he knew that belief had been shattered. This was no longer about simple solutions or quick fixes. This was a fight for his children's future, and everything he had once known was on the line. The days that followed Liam's call were filled with intense preparation. Lisa had been more focused than ever, but Jake could tell that the weight of the case was taking a toll on her too. Their team had been strategizing non-stop, reviewing every detail and analyzing every angle. But as the trial dragged on, it became clearer, this was more than just a legal battle, it was a battle for control, for who would have the power over their children's lives. Jake sat in the courtroom every day, feeling the heavy presence of Sarah's lawyer, Robert Ellis, watching him like a hawk. Every word, every gesture, every misstep could be used against him. He had learned to control his emotions, to keep his composure in check, but the pressure was unbearable. The courtroom had become a battleground, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The next day, as they prepared for another round of arguments, something unexpected happened. Lisa called Jake into her office, her face grim. "There's something we need to discuss," she said. "Ellis has something up his sleeve, and I think it could change everything." Jake's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" Lisa glanced down at her notes before meeting his gaze. "He's going to bring up a letter. A letter that Liam wrote." Jake's heart stopped. "A letter? What does that have to do with anything?" Lisa's expression darkened. "Apparently, Liam wrote it a few weeks ago, and Sarah found it. It's a letter addressed to you, Jake. In it, he says he doesn't want to go back to Sarah's place, that he feels unsafe, and that he wants to stay with you." Jake's mind raced. He had no idea Liam had written such a letter. And if Sarah was going to use it against him in court, it could be devastating. It painted him as the hero, the father who understood his son's pain and frustration, but it also painted Sarah as the villain, someone who was pushing her children away. "Is it real?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa nodded. "I have no idea. But Ellis will use it, and we have to be ready for that." Jake's thoughts began to spiral. Could Liam really have felt that way? He had always tried to protect his son from the emotional turmoil of the divorce, tried to make sure he didn't feel caught between two worlds. But now, it seemed like Liam had been harboring a deep fear, one that had led him to write this letter. Jake felt his stomach churn. How had he not seen this? How had he not known that his son was struggling this much? "It doesn't matter," Lisa said, cutting through his thoughts. "We need to get ahead of this. We can't let Ellis use this letter to paint you as an unstable father. We need to prove that Liam's well-being is your priority. That his feelings matter. Jake nodded, though his mind was still reeling. How would he face this in court? How could he explain this to Sarah? If Liam's fears were true, if he had been suffering because of the tension between his parents, Jake didn't know if he could ever forgive himself for not noticing sooner. The day of the court hearing arrived with an ominous weight hanging over Jake. His stomach was in knots as he entered the courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. Sarah sat across from him, her face unreadable, her lawyer at her side, looking more confident than ever. Jake could feel her eyes on him, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the room faded away. It was just the two of them, caught in a battle for something they both cared about, something they had once built together. The judge called the session to order, and the room fell silent. Ellis stood up, his voice steady and assured. "Your Honor," he began, "we have a new piece of evidence that sheds light on the defendant's character, and it's important that the court consider it." He turned and walked toward the judge's bench, holding out a piece of paper. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as Ellis continued. "This letter," Ellis said, his voice cold and calculating, "was written by the child, Liam Carter. It details his feelings of fear and discomfort at his father's home. He expresses his desire to remain with his mother, stating that he doesn't feel safe in his father's care." Jake felt his chest tighten. He glanced over at Lisa, whose expression was a mixture of concern and frustration. She stood and immediately objected. "Objection, Your Honor," Lisa said firmly. "We have no way of verifying the authenticity of this letter. And more importantly, it's inappropriate to present a letter written by a child as evidence in a case like this." The judge, a stern woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, looked from Ellis to Lisa. She didn't seem convinced. "I will allow the letter to be presented as evidence, but I will also consider the context in which it was written. Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say about this?" Jake stood, his legs shaking beneath him. He had to say something. He had to defend himself, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He looked at Sarah for the first time since the trial began. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw set, her eyes cold. "I don't know what to say," Jake said, his voice rough. "I didn't know about this letter. If Liam wrote it, it's because he's scared, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love me or that I'm a bad father. I've tried to protect him and Emily from this whole situation. I never wanted them to feel torn between us." Ellis quickly interjected, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Your Honor, this letter clearly shows that Mr. Carter's actions have created a toxic environment for the children. It's no wonder that Liam feels this way." Jake's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. This was it, the moment where everything could either crumble or turn around. "I'm not perfect," Jake continued, "but I love my children more than anything in the world. And I'll fight for them, for their safety, for their happiness, no matter what. I'll never stop fighting for them." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, the judge nodded. "We'll recess for the day. The court will reconvene tomorrow to further discuss this new evidence." As Jake walked back to his seat, his heart was heavy with uncertainty. The battle was far from over. But in that brief moment, when he had spoken from the heart, he knew that he wasn't going to let this fight defeat him. Not when it came to his children. Tomorrow would be a new day. And he would face it head on. The night before the next day's hearing, Jake couldn't sleep. The weight of the trial, of the looming decision that could change everything for his children, kept him awake. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, his thoughts spinning, replaying every moment from the court, every word spoken, every tiny decision that had led him here. He had felt his world slipping away with each accusation, with each painful revelation, but now, with Liam's letter in the mix, he had the overwhelming sense that things were only going to get worse before they could get better. He thought about the letter, Liam's letter. His son had been scared, frightened enough to put his feelings into words. And though the idea of his son feeling that way ripped Jake apart, there was a part of him that understood. Divorce, especially one as bitter as this, wasn't something that children could easily cope with. But what hurt the most was that Sarah had chosen to use that letter as a weapon against him, instead of considering the emotional pain their children were going through. Sarah had always been a good mother. But this? This was a different side of her, a side Jake hadn't seen before. The battle for custody had changed everything, turning her into a stranger. There was no longer any warmth or shared understanding. She was now an opponent, and Jake had to be prepared for the fight of his life. He glanced at the clock. 3:45 a.m. He hadn't been able to get more than an hour of sleep, but there was no use in trying now. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, needing something to clear his mind. As he opened the fridge, he saw the old photographs of him and the kids, tucked into a magnet holder. There was one of Emily at her first soccer game, grinning widely as Jake held up a sign that said, "Best Dad Ever." And next to it, another photo of Liam, looking serious but proud, standing next to Jake after their weekend camping trip. Suddenly, the memories hit him harder than he expected. The laughter, the fun, the simple moments where everything felt right. His throat tightened, and he cursed under his breath. He hadn't done enough to protect those moments, and now it felt like he was losing everything. The sound of his phone ringing shattered his thoughts. It was Lisa. "Jake," she said, her voice urgent. "I think we've got a problem." Jake's heart sank. "What now?" "I just spoke to the judge's clerk," Lisa said, "and I think she's going to take the letter seriously. It's already been introduced as evidence, and Ellis is going to use it to question your fitness as a parent. This is a turning point." Jake's mind raced. He had prepared for every angle of attack, but nothing could have prepared him for his son's own words being used against him. "I don't know what to do, Lisa," Jake admitted. "I've tried everything. I've always tried to be there for my kids. But it's like I'm being painted as the villain." "You're not the villain, Jake," Lisa reassured him. "But you need to get ahead of this. The judge needs to see that you're emotionally invested in your children's well-being, that you understand their needs. We need to focus on your connection with them, not just the legal arguments. Show them what kind of father you really are. You've got to turn this around tomorrow." Jake's chest tightened. Could he really do that? Could he make the court see the father he knew he was beneath the legal drama, beneath the accusations? He had to. He owed it to Emily and Liam to do whatever it took to protect them. The following morning, Jake stood in the courtroom, trying to steady his breathing. It felt like the walls were closing in, the pressure mounting with each passing second. Sarah's lawyer, Ellis, was sitting across from him, a smug expression on his face as if he had already won. Jake could feel the weight of the letter hanging over him, looming like a shadow. His son's words had been twisted and misinterpreted, and now they were being used against him. It was as if his worst nightmare was coming to life. But Jake had one last thing he needed to say. One last opportunity to make the court see the truth. The judge called the court to order, and Ellis wasted no time in jumping into his argument. "Your Honor, as we discussed, this letter from the child Liam Carter clearly shows the emotional strain Mr. Carter has put on his son. It's evident that Liam does not feel safe or comfortable at his father's house, and the emotional distress he is under is undeniable. Given the circumstances, it is clear that the best interest of the child would be served by placing him in his mother's care, where he can be in a stable and nurturing environment." Jake felt his heart pound in his chest as Ellis spoke, each word cutting deeper than the last. He knew what Ellis was trying to do. He was trying to strip away any credibility Jake had left in the eyes of the court. But Jake wouldn't let him. The judge turned her gaze to Jake. "Mr. Carter, do you have any response to this?" Jake stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium. This was it. The moment where everything could either fall apart or start to heal. "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice steady despite the turbulence inside him, "I never wanted my kids to feel torn between us. I never wanted them to feel unsafe. I've spent every day of my life trying to be the best father I can be, and it breaks my heart to hear that Liam feels that way. But I will not let this be the defining moment of my relationship with him. Or with Emily. He paused, his eyes scanning the courtroom, locking on Sarah for the first time since the trial began. For a moment, their eyes met. It was strange, she looked at him, but there was no emotion in her eyes, no hint of understanding. Only cold detachment. But Jake wasn't going to let that stop him. I know I'm not perfect, he continued, his voice growing more emotional. I've made mistakes, but I've always tried to learn from them. And I'm not going to give up on my children. I'm here because I believe in them. I believe in our family. I believe that despite everything we've gone through, I'm the best person for them. Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm their father. And no one will love them the way I do. There was a long, tense silence in the courtroom as Jake's words hung in the air. For the first time in days, he felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about winning the case. It was about showing his children that he would always fight for them, no matter the cost. That he wasn't going to let anyone, especially Sarah, take them away from him. The judge nodded slowly, clearly moved by Jake's words. I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Carter. The court will take your statement into consideration. As Jake sat down, he knew that he had just given everything he had left. He had put himself on the line, laid bare the depths of his love for his children. Now, all he could do was wait. The emotional climax had come, and Jake had stepped into the fire, hoping that his love for his children would be enough to win them back. The court recessed for lunch, and Jake stepped out of the room, feeling the weight of the trial pressing down on him. The air in the hallway felt thick, stifling. His mind raced with everything that had happened, his words in the courtroom, the letter, the look in Sarah's eyes. It was all so overwhelming. The exhaustion, the fear, and the uncertainty clouded his every thought. But as he stepped outside for a brief break, something in him felt different, lighter in a way. Lisa caught up with him as he stood by the courthouse steps, staring out into the street. Jake, that was incredible, she said, her voice filled with admiration. You took control in there. I think the judge saw that. You didn't just argue the facts, you argued your heart. Jake glanced over at her, the corners of his lips lifting faintly. I'm not sure it matters if the judge saw it, Lisa. I'm not sure it matters if anyone saw it. I'm still terrified of what comes next. I can't stop thinking about how Liam feels. If he feels like he's being torn apart. Lisa's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. I know. But you have to remember this, you showed them who you really are. Not as a father caught up in a legal fight, but as someone who would do anything for his kids. The letter, the accusations, they don't change that. If anything, it's showing the court how far you're willing to go to fight for them. You can't control the past, Jake, but you can control the future. Jake exhaled sharply, letting her words sink in. I've spent so long trying to get back to some kind of normal. I thought if I just worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. But now I see, maybe it was never about the normal. Maybe it was always about showing them that I was their constant. That no matter what happened between Sarah and me, I would always be here for them. No matter what. Lisa nodded, a proud smile on her face. Exactly. And you've done that today. You didn't just defend yourself, Jake. You defended the kind of father you want to be. And that's something no one can take away from you. Jake looked out at the bustling street, the people rushing by, each with their own life, their own battles. But in that moment, he felt a quiet certainty. He was doing the right thing. He was showing his children that love could stand up to anything, even a courtroom full of accusations. They made their way back to the courtroom, and as the afternoon wore on, the final arguments began. Sarah's lawyer pushed hard, trying to undermine every statement Jake had made, twisting his words, suggesting that his emotional outpouring was a calculated strategy. It was hard to keep his composure when Ellis relentlessly painted him as unstable, trying to paint him as the villain in this saga. Yet, with every attack, Jake felt more rooted in his resolve. Finally, the judge called for a brief recess before delivering her final decision. Jake found himself alone in the quiet of the hallway, his stomach turning in knots once more. But instead of the paralyzing dread that had consumed him in the early days of the trial, Jake felt a new sense of strength. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Whatever the outcome, there would be more battles, more arguments, more heartbreak. But he had come to realize something fundamental about fatherhood: it wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about showing up. It was about being there, day in and day out, for the children who depended on him. And as he stood there, waiting for the judge's decision, Jake understood that whatever happened, he had done everything he could to show his children that he was there for them. The rest was in their hands, and in the hands of fate. But in his heart, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The judge called them back into the courtroom, and Jake took his seat. Sarah was already there, her face neutral. His heart pounded in his chest as the judge read aloud her decision. After considering all the evidence presented, including the emotional well-being of both children, I find that the custody arrangement will remain as is for now. However, both parties will undergo family counseling to address the issues raised during this trial, and visitation schedules will be adjusted to ensure the children's needs are prioritized. Jake could barely process the words. His mind was racing. Was that it? Had they won? Or was this just another complication in an already convoluted situation? The judge continued, her voice firm. I believe that both parents love their children and have shown the capacity to care for them. However, there are emotional concerns that must be addressed. This decision is not the end of the matter, but a step in the right direction toward healing and resolution. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't the victory he'd hoped for, but it wasn't a defeat either. They had time. Time to work on the issues, time to heal, and most importantly, time to show his children that they could move forward, no matter how messy the past had been. As he walked out of the courtroom, he caught a glimpse of Sarah. For a brief moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but in that quiet glance, there was something unspoken, something that passed between them in that silent understanding. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. But maybe, just maybe, they were on the same side in this one thing: the well-being of their children. Jake stepped outside, the sun now low in the sky. It had been a long, exhausting day, but he felt a glimmer of hope. Things were far from perfect, but perhaps they didn't need to be. Maybe the true measure of a family wasn't in whether everything worked out perfectly, but in whether the love and effort were enough to overcome the obstacles they faced. He looked at his phone, seeing a message from Liam: Dad, I'm glad you're my dad. I don't care about anything else. Jake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. He was still their father. And that was enough. And as he stood there, surrounded by the world still moving on, Jake knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. In the days that followed the court decision, Jake found himself struggling with something he hadn't expected: relief. It wasn't the relief of having won, because he hadn't won in the way he'd hoped. But it was the kind of relief that came with a pause in the chaos. The storm hadn't ended, but it had shifted its course, and Jake knew he had time. Time to rebuild, time to heal, and time to be the father his children deserved. But even as the days passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The victory in court hadn't solved everything. It hadn't even begun to scratch the surface of the deeper issues that had torn apart his family. For all the assurances he'd given to Lisa and himself, Jake couldn't deny the lingering doubts about whether he truly understood the emotional toll this battle had taken on his children. Emily and Liam had been quieter lately. They'd both seemed to retreat into themselves, and despite the reassurance that they would have family counseling sessions with their mother, Jake was growing concerned that the distance between them was growing. He could see it in their eyes, in the way Liam barely looked up when Jake spoke to him, and the way Emily had stopped sharing the small details of her day like she used to. It wasn't just the kids, either. Jake felt the strain in his own relationships. Even though he had family and friends around him, there was a sense of isolation that he hadn't experienced before. The people closest to him, including Lisa, tried to offer support, but there was only so much they could do. Everyone was so wrapped up in the legalities of the case, in the emotional weight of it all, that Jake couldn't help but feel like he was fighting this battle alone. It was late one night, a week after the court decision, that Jake decided he couldn't stay in this holding pattern any longer. He needed to take action. He needed to do more for his children. The legal battle may have slowed, but his children's emotional scars were still there, raw and tender. Jake stood in front of his bedroom mirror, the reflection staring back at him, a tired, worn man. But something in his eyes was different now. It was determination. Not to win this battle for custody or prove anything in court, but to fight for his children in a way that mattered most. By showing them he was truly there, in every way they needed. The next day, Jake drove to a park where he used to take the kids every Saturday morning. He parked his car and took a deep breath before stepping out, as if preparing for something that could change everything. He'd called Liam and Emily to meet him there after school, and now, as he stood by the old wooden swings, he couldn't help but feel that familiar nervousness. This wasn't just a regular day. Today was about connecting. Reaching out. Doing something, anything, to remind them that their father was still here, still fighting, and still ready to be the dad they needed him to be. When Liam and Emily finally arrived, they looked almost like strangers. It had been so long since they'd shared this kind of moment together. They were older, their faces more mature than the kids Jake remembered, yet they still carried that same spark in their eyes. "Hey, Dad," Liam said, his voice quieter than usual. He kicked at the gravel under his feet, avoiding eye contact. Jake smiled, though it was a nervous smile. "Hey, buddy. I thought we could hang out here for a while. Remember when we used to come here every Saturday?" Emily nodded slowly, but her eyes were distant. "Yeah, I remember." She sat on one of the benches, her arms crossed over her chest. Jake felt a twinge of guilt at how distant they seemed. He'd always tried so hard to be a good father, to give them everything, but now it felt like nothing he did could bridge the gap that had grown between them. The realization stung, but it also fueled him. He had to try, and he had to try harder than he ever had before. He walked over to where they were sitting and took a seat beside them. "You two have been through a lot lately," Jake began, his voice low, vulnerable. "I know it's been tough, and I haven't always known how to help. But I want you to know that no matter what, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm sorry if you feel like I haven't been there when you needed me." The silence hung between them for a long moment. Emily was the first to speak. "Dad, we don't know what to feel anymore. It's just, so much has happened. It's like everything changed overnight." Liam nodded in agreement. "I just want it to stop. All the fighting, all the court stuff. It's like I can't even talk to anyone without feeling like I'm in the middle of it." Jake's heart broke for them. This wasn't what he wanted for his children. They shouldn't have to carry this weight. "I understand," Jake said quietly. "I don't know what you're going through, but I promise I'm going to do everything I can to make it better. We're going to figure this out together, okay?" Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something solid. "But, can you really fix it, Dad? Can we really go back to how things were before?" Jake didn't have an answer, at least not one that felt right. The truth was, he didn't know if things could ever go back to the way they were. But what he did know was that they could move forward. And that was enough. "I don't know if we can go back, Emily," Jake replied, "but I know that we can make new memories. We can start fresh. It won't be easy, but I'm not going to give up. I'm your dad, and I'll always be your dad, no matter what happens." Liam finally looked up at him, his expression softer than it had been in days. "I know you love us, Dad. It's just hard." Jake reached out and placed his hand on Liam's shoulder. "I know, buddy. I know it's hard. But we'll get through this, one step at a time. Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake saw a flicker of something in both of his kids' eyes. Hope. The kind of hope that was buried beneath the weight of their emotions but was still there, waiting to be nurtured. As they spent the rest of the afternoon at the park, playing catch, talking, and sharing simple moments that reminded Jake of what he was fighting for, he knew that this wasn't the end of their journey, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. The road ahead would be long, and there would still be moments of doubt and fear. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt confident. He wasn't alone in this fight. And most importantly, his children weren't alone either. They were still a family, and he was still their father. And that was enough for now. The days following their afternoon at the park were filled with a strange blend of hope and uncertainty. Jake knew the court battle wasn't over. The decision had bought them time, but it had also revealed the depth of the wounds that had been left in the wake of the divorce. Time couldn't heal everything, but it could give them the space they needed to rebuild. Jake, however, found himself in uncharted waters. The custody battle was only one part of the storm. The emotional fallout from it was much more complicated than he had anticipated. His relationship with Emily and Liam was still fragile. They were trying, but there was a distance between them that was difficult to bridge. At night, Jake would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how to be the father they needed him to be. His mind often drifted to the moments he had with them before the divorce. The way Liam would excitedly show him his soccer trophies, or how Emily would curl up next to him on the couch with a book, her voice animated as she read aloud. Those simple moments felt like a lifetime ago, and Jake couldn't help but mourn their loss. But he also knew something had changed between them that afternoon at the park. Emily had looked him in the eyes without the wall of anger or sadness that had been there for months. Liam, though still distant, had seemed to relax, if only slightly. They were both trying, in their own way. And so was Jake. But the question remained, was it enough? Was trying enough to fix everything that had been broken? The weeks passed in a blur. Jake focused on being present, on listening when Emily and Liam opened up, even if it was just a little. He drove them to school, picked them up afterward, and sat with them during dinner. He tried to be the kind of father who showed up, no matter how small the moment seemed. But there were still times when he would catch a glimpse of their sadness, of the invisible scars that the trial had left on them, and he would wonder if it was even possible to heal those wounds. Then, one Friday afternoon, a call came that would change everything. Jake had just finished a meeting at work when his phone rang. It was Lisa. "Hey, Jake, I think you need to come over. There's something I need to talk to you about." Jake's stomach dropped. He could hear the urgency in her voice, and his heart began to race. He didn't even need to ask what was going on, he could feel it. Something had shifted. "Is everything okay with the kids?" Jake asked, his voice tight. "I think you need to see for yourself," Lisa replied. "It's about Emily." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed to his car, every second feeling like an eternity. Emily had seemed fine, or at least as fine as she could be, but Lisa's tone told him that something had changed. When Jake arrived at Lisa's house, Emily was sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She didn't look up as Jake entered the room, and his stomach sank. Lisa motioned for him to sit beside Emily, who was staring blankly ahead. "What happened?" Jake asked, his voice softer now, trying to read his daughter's expression. Lisa hesitated before speaking. "Emily found something at school today. A letter that she didn't understand, but it's causing her a lot of confusion." Jake frowned. "A letter? What kind of letter?" Lisa reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She handed it to Jake, who unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was familiar, though it was messy, as if the writer had been in a hurry. As Jake read the letter, his heart dropped. The words seemed to blur together, but the message was clear enough: I never wanted this. You don't know how much I regret what happened. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But it's too late now, and I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me someday. Jake's blood ran cold. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Sarah's. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. Dad, what does this mean? Why is Mom writing letters like this? Jake felt his throat tighten. He didn't know how to answer her. There was so much he didn't understand himself. The letter was cryptic, vague, and painful. And yet, it was impossible to ignore the guilt in her words, the unmistakable remorse that Sarah had left behind, buried in this letter. Emily, I'm not sure what this letter means, Jake said carefully, his voice wavering. But I want you to know something: this isn't your fault. You didn't cause this. Whatever's happening with your mom, we'll figure it out together, okay? But Emily wasn't listening. Her eyes filled with tears as she stood up abruptly, the letter still clenched in her hand. I don't understand, Dad. I don't get it. Why is Mom writing these things? Why is she saying she regrets everything? It doesn't make sense. Jake stood up as well, reaching for Emily. Sweetheart, I know this is hard. I wish I could explain everything, but right now, all I can tell you is that we'll get through this together. I'll help you understand. But Emily pulled away from him, her face a mixture of sadness and frustration. I don't think you can help me with this. I don't think anyone can. She turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Jake standing there, heartbroken and at a loss. Lisa watched him closely, her expression unreadable. Jake, this changes things. She's carrying something so heavy right now. And we both know that this letter isn't just about Emily. It's about Sarah, too. We need to figure out what's going on. This isn't over. Jake nodded slowly, his mind racing. Emily's reaction had confirmed something he had feared for a long time: there were deeper layers to the pain she and Liam were feeling. It wasn't just the divorce. It wasn't just the court case. It was something Sarah had left behind, and it was threatening to unravel everything. As Jake stood there, the weight of the moment settling in, he realized that the hardest part was just beginning. There were more truths to uncover, more pain to face, and more choices to make. But one thing was clear: he had to protect his kids, no matter the cost. And this time, it wasn't just about winning in court. It was about finding a way to heal, and that would require confronting everything, even the things they weren't ready to face. He just hoped they could all make it through the storm together. The weight of the letter from Sarah hung over Jake like a storm cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the beginning of something much darker. As the days passed, the unease gnawed at him. The more he thought about Emily's reaction, the more he realized that this was not something that could be ignored. The letter was more than just an apology, it was a confession of sorts, and one that could unravel everything Jake had believed about his family. Jake spent the weekend trying to piece together the fragments of the situation. He had so many questions, but no clear answers. What was Sarah trying to say in that letter? And why had Emily been the one to find it? It wasn't like Sarah to leave behind something so cryptic, so full of guilt. If anything, Sarah had always been the one to avoid confrontation, to bury her feelings deep within. This letter, however, was a crack in her carefully constructed facade. On Sunday night, Jake sat down with Emily, after she had calmed down from her emotional outburst. He could tell she was still grappling with the weight of what she had discovered, but he knew that now was the time to get to the bottom of it. Can we talk?" Jake asked, his voice softer than usual. "I know this has been hard for you, but I want to understand what's going on. You don't have to go through this alone. Emily glanced at him, her face still clouded with confusion. I don't get it, Dad. I don't know what's happening, and I feel like I can't trust anyone. Not Mom. Not even you. Her voice trembled, the rawness of her emotions spilling out. I just found a letter from Mom. And it doesn't make sense. She says she's sorry, that she regrets everything. But why now? Why after everything we've been through? Jake swallowed hard, his own emotions rising to the surface. He had never seen Emily so vulnerable before, so broken. It killed him to see her like this, especially when he had no clear answers to offer her. I know it's confusing, Jake said gently. And I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers. But I do know one thing, you're not alone in this. Whatever your mom is going through, we'll face it together. But we need to be honest with each other. Do you think that maybe, just maybe, there's something more to this than what we see on the surface? Emily looked up at him, her expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. What do you mean? I mean, Emily, sometimes the people we love carry things that we don't know about, Jake replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Maybe your mom has been holding something inside for a long time. Maybe she's been carrying guilt, regret, or fear that we didn't see. But whatever it is, I promise we'll figure it out. Together. There was a long silence between them. Emily didn't say anything right away, but Jake could see the wheels turning in her mind. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. I don't know if I can forgive her, Dad, Emily finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever understand why she did what she did. And I don't know if I want to. Jake's heart broke for her, but he understood. The pain of betrayal, whether intentional or not, was never easy to overcome. It was raw, cutting deep into the heart, leaving scars that took a lifetime to heal. I don't have the answers either, Em, Jake said softly. But I'll be here for you, no matter what. And I'll help you understand, even if it takes time. You don't have to do this alone. We're in this together. Emily nodded slowly, the walls around her beginning to crack, but still, there was hesitation in her eyes. Jake didn't push her further. He knew that the healing process was a journey, and it couldn't be rushed. All he could do was offer her his support, his unwavering presence, and hope that in time, Emily would find the answers she was searching for. As the days passed, Jake couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and the letter. There was something about it that felt off, like there was more to the story than he knew. He tried calling Sarah, but she didn't answer. The silence between them was deafening. Every time he reached out, it felt like he was banging on a door that refused to open. Then, one night, after weeks of trying to get through to Sarah, Jake received a call that changed everything. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Jake, it's Sarah. Jake's heart skipped a beat. It had been so long since they had spoken. The last time they'd exchanged words had been during the court hearings, and those words hadn't been kind. There was so much unresolved tension between them, and now, with the discovery of the letter, everything felt even more complicated. Sarah, Jake replied, his voice cautious but filled with a sense of urgency. What's going on? We need to talk about the letter. Emily found it, and she's confused, hurt. I need to understand what you meant by what you wrote. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could hear Sarah breathing, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Finally, she spoke. Jake, I didn't know where else to turn. I didn't want Emily or Liam to find out this way, but I've been carrying something for a long time, and I don't know how to make it right. Jake's stomach churned. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. The truth was finally going to come out, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. What are you talking about, Sarah? Jake asked, his voice shaking slightly. What have you been hiding? Another long pause. I don't know how to explain this, but I've been struggling with something I did. Something I should have told you a long time ago. But I didn't, and now it's too late." Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The words felt like they were suffocating him, but he couldn't stop himself from asking. "Tell me, Sarah. Please. What did you do?" Sarah's voice broke as she finally said the words that would shatter everything. "I had an affair, Jake. With someone we both knew. And it was a mistake, one that I can never undo. But I couldn't face you with it. I couldn't look you in the eyes and admit what I had done. And now it's all coming to light." Jake's world tilted. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. He had suspected something, but to hear it spoken aloud, to have Sarah confess in such a matter-of-fact way, was a gut punch. The betrayal was more than he could comprehend in that moment. The silence between them felt like an eternity, and Jake's mind raced, trying to process the words that had just been spoken. "Who was it?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the question escaping before he could stop himself. I can't tell you right now, Jake. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, and I never wanted this to happen to our family. I'm so sorry." The weight of the confession hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating everything in its path. Jake's hands shook as he gripped the phone tighter. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her for this, but he knew one thing for sure, it wasn't just the kids that had been hurt. It was all of them. And now, the truth had been buried so deep that it was threatening to rip their world apart. How could he ever move past this? How could he ever heal when the person he had trusted most had betrayed him in the worst way possible? There was no easy answer, and Jake knew that the road ahead would be long and painful. But one thing was certain, the fight for his family, for his children, was far from over. And the truth, no matter how ugly, had to come out. Even if it meant tearing them all apart before they could rebuild. Jake's mind was racing as he hung up the phone with Sarah. Her confession had shattered everything he thought he knew about their marriage. The weight of her words felt like a physical presence, pressing against his chest. He had suspected something for a while, small signs, distant behavior, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it from her, sent his world into a tailspin. He sat there in the quiet of his living room, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The kids were with Lisa, having spent the weekend at her house. Jake hadn't told them anything about the conversation yet, and he wasn't sure when or if he ever would. Emily had already been through so much, and Liam, though quieter than usual, hadn't asked too many questions. But now, with Sarah's admission still echoing in his ears, Jake knew that things could never go back to the way they were. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. He couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over in his head, trying to make sense of it all. The affair. The betrayal. Sarah's inability to face him with the truth for so long. He couldn't comprehend how everything had come to this point. But there was one thing Jake knew for certain, his family, as he once knew it, was gone. The foundation had been cracked irreparably. And now, with Emily and Liam already struggling with the divorce, the betrayal could very well be the final blow to their fragile relationship. Jake stood up, pacing the room. There were so many questions left unanswered. Who had Sarah been with? Was it someone from their past? How long had it been going on? But those questions felt trivial compared to the emotional devastation they had caused. Even if he could find out the details, what would that matter now? The damage had been done. And then, there was Emily. She had already been through so much, and now, she would have to face the truth about her mother. Jake knew this would break her. It would be another scar she'd carry for the rest of her life. But how could he protect her from the truth? How could he shield her from something so deeply rooted in their family's history? As Jake thought about it, he realized that he needed to talk to Sarah. He needed to understand why she had kept this secret for so long. Why hadn't she told him before the divorce? Why had she waited until everything was on the verge of collapsing before confessing? He picked up the phone again and dialed Sarah's number. This time, when she picked up, her voice sounded raw, almost as if she had been crying. "I'm sorry, Jake," she said quietly. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Jake's voice was cold, the anger bubbling up inside him, but he held it back. "I don't understand. Why now, Sarah? Why after everything? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jake could hear Sarah's shallow breaths as she tried to collect herself. "I don't know," she replied finally. "I thought I could fix it, I thought I could make things right. But I was wrong. I've been living in fear, Jake, of losing everything, and I didn't know how to face you. I thought if I kept quiet, maybe it would all go away. But it didn't. And now I'm just a mess." Jake's heart clenched as he listened to her, but the anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't get it, Sarah. We've already lost everything. This is the final nail in the coffin." "I know," she whispered. "And I can't undo it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I need you to know that it wasn't about you, not really. It was about me. My own weaknesses. My own mistakes." Jake felt a pang of sorrow for the woman who had once been his wife, but the bitterness was stronger. The truth was a knife in his heart, twisting deeper with every word she spoke. "I don't know what to say," Jake said quietly. "This isn't something I can just forget, Sarah. And the kids, they deserve so much more than this. I don't know how to help them with this. How do I protect them from all the lies?" "They're going to be okay," Sarah said, her voice soft but broken. "You'll figure it out. You're a good dad, Jake. You always have been. Just take care of them." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "You've really messed this up, Sarah. I don't know how we're going to move forward from this." "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Jake didn't know if he could ever look at Sarah the same way again. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had loved for so long, had betrayed him in a way that was beyond repair. The kids, Emily, especially, would never be the same. And as much as he wanted to protect them, he couldn't shield them from the truth forever. The conversation with Sarah ended on an awkward note, neither of them knowing how to leave things. But Jake couldn't linger on it any longer. He had to focus on his kids. They were his priority now. The next morning, Jake sat down with Emily and Liam. He had to tell them what had happened, as painful as it would be. They had already been through so much, but the truth was no longer something he could hide from them. "Kids," Jake began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about your mom." Emily and Liam exchanged wary glances. Emily's face was tense, and Liam's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your mom, she made a mistake." "A big one," Jake said, struggling to find the right words. "She did something that hurt our family, and she's been carrying that pain for a long time. I know you both have been struggling with a lot of things lately, and this won't make it easier. But I want you to know that this isn't your fault. This is between your mom and me. It's not something you need to fix." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he didn't know how. This was a wound that he couldn't heal with words alone. "I know it's hard to understand," Jake continued, "but I want you both to know that I love you, and I'll always be here for you. No matter what happens, we'll face this together. I promise you that." Emily nodded slowly, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. Liam, though silent, seemed to be taking it in, his usual quiet demeanor masking the turmoil he must have been feeling inside. Jake didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to make this pain go away, or how to rebuild the trust that had been broken. But he knew that he couldn't give up on them. He had to keep fighting, for them, for himself, and for their family. The road ahead would be long, and filled with more struggles than he could anticipate, but Jake had made a decision. No matter how broken their family seemed, he wasn't going to let it crumble. He would do whatever it took to hold them together. Even if it meant facing the hardest truths of all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The silence in the house was deafening. Jake sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, the events of the last few days swirling in his mind. The conversation with Emily and Liam had gone as expected, awkward, heartbreaking, and filled with unsaid words that lingered in the air long after they had all left the table. He hadn't expected them to fully understand the gravity of the situation, nor did he expect them to forgive their mother overnight. But there was something about their reactions that stuck with him, like an unresolved chord in a song that kept playing in his head. Emily had been distant, her eyes red from the tears she'd fought to hold back, and Liam, quiet as ever, had barely said a word, retreating into his room as soon as he could. It was all too much for them, and Jake knew it. They were both still processing the divorce, the splitting of their family, and now this, another wound that would take time to heal, if it ever did. As much as Jake hated to admit it, the weight of everything was starting to take its toll on him. There were days when he could barely summon the energy to get out of bed, and then there were moments when he felt an overwhelming urge to fight for his kids, to protect them from the mess that life had become. But how could he fight for them when he was drowning in the same mess himself? The doorbell rang, pulling Jake out of his spiraling thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. It was the middle of the day, and the kids were at school, so it must have been a visitor. Jake sighed, setting his coffee down and standing up slowly. He shuffled toward the front door, his mind still preoccupied with the fallout from his conversation with his children. When he opened the door, standing in front of him was an unexpected face. It was Lisa. "Hey, Jake," she said softly, her eyes searching his face, almost as if she were waiting for a sign, an invitation to speak. Jake blinked, surprised to see her standing there. They hadn't spoken much since the divorce proceedings had begun. Their interactions had mostly been limited to discussions about the kids. Jake had always appreciated Lisa's calm demeanor, especially in moments like this when things felt like they were unraveling. "Hey, Lisa," Jake replied, stepping aside to let her in. "What's up?" Lisa entered the house, her movements tentative as she glanced around, almost like she was unsure of how much of her presence Jake could handle. "I wanted to check in with you," she said, her voice quiet but concerned. "How are you doing? I know it's been rough with the kids, and with everything else." Jake gave a small shrug, his exhaustion written across his face. "I'm surviving. I don't really know what else to say. It's been a mess." Lisa nodded, sitting down at the kitchen table across from him. "I get it. It's hard, Jake. I can't imagine how you must feel. But you're not alone, okay? I'm here for you. If you need anything, just let me know." Jake looked at her, her kind eyes offering comfort in a way that few people could. He had always respected Lisa's ability to remain neutral in difficult situations, especially during the divorce, when she could have easily sided with one party or the other. But Lisa had always been about the kids, about what was best for them, and that made her someone Jake could lean on. "I don't know what to do, Lisa," he confessed, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm trying to be there for them, but I'm falling apart too. I feel like I'm failing as a father. How do I fix this? How do I make it better for them when I can't even make it better for myself?" Lisa's expression softened, and she reached across the table to place a hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a lifeline in that moment. "You don't have to fix everything, Jake," she said gently. "You're doing the best you can, and that's all you can do. You're there for them. You love them. That's what matters. The rest, it'll take time." But you've got to give yourself some grace, too. You're going through a lot right now. You're allowed to feel how you're feeling. Jake exhaled slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He'd been so focused on being the perfect father, the perfect protector, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel the pain of everything he'd lost. He had buried his own emotions in an attempt to stay strong for Emily and Liam, but the truth was, he couldn't keep it up forever. "Thank you, Lisa," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "I really needed to hear that." Lisa smiled, a soft, understanding smile that told Jake everything he needed to know. She didn't have all the answers, but she was there, offering him a support that felt genuine, without judgment. After a moment, Jake spoke again, his voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about talking to Sarah again. About the affair. But I don't know what I'm hoping to accomplish. Part of me wants to hear her side of things, but another part of me just wants to walk away from it all." Lisa didn't flinch at the mention of Sarah's name. She was well aware of the situation, having seen the toll it had taken on Jake and the kids. "Jake, I think you need to do whatever feels right for you. If talking to Sarah will help you find some closure, then do it. But don't expect it to make everything better, because it might not. Sometimes, people make decisions that we'll never understand, and we have to come to terms with that. But you don't owe her anything anymore. You owe it to yourself and to your kids to move forward, however that looks." Jake sat back in his chair, his mind processing Lisa's words. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face Sarah again, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep carrying around this burden without finding some resolution, even if it meant confronting the hardest part of his life. As the conversation drifted into lighter topics, Jake realized that he wasn't as alone as he had felt earlier. He had people who cared about him, people who were willing to stand by him, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. And that, in itself, was something to hold on to. When Lisa left, Jake felt a sense of calm he hadn't had in days. There was still so much to figure out, so many unanswered questions, so much pain to process, but he had a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let his family slip away from him without a fight. He had his children to think about. He had to protect them, guide them through the storm, and show them that, no matter how broken they all felt, they would get through it together. The road ahead would be long, filled with more difficult conversations and moments of doubt. But Jake was determined to find a way through the darkness, for his kids, and for himself. And somehow, even with everything that had happened, he knew that they would find their way to the other side. Eventually. The days after Lisa's visit passed in a blur. Jake spent most of his time trying to hold everything together for Emily and Liam. It was as if every corner of his life had been invaded by the uncertainty of the divorce, Sarah's betrayal, and his own feelings of inadequacy. But with Lisa's words still echoing in his mind, he began to think more about his own healing, about the parts of him he had neglected while he focused on fixing things for everyone else. The kids seemed to be slipping further away from him. Emily, who had always been his little confidant, was now distant, her face often buried in her phone, eyes glazed over with thoughts that Jake couldn't reach. Liam, who rarely opened up about his feelings, had withdrawn into his room more than usual. Jake had tried to talk to them, to reassure them, but it felt like each time he tried, he was met with an impenetrable wall. One evening, as Jake cleaned up after dinner, Emily came into the kitchen. She didn't say anything at first, but there was a certain hesitance in the air, an unspoken question that hung between them. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed in front of her, and Jake could feel the tension radiating from her. "How's school?" he asked, trying to break the silence with a neutral question, hoping to ease the discomfort. "It's fine," Emily replied, her voice flat. She didn't make eye contact. "Same as always." Jake could feel the heaviness in her response, and it hurt him more than he wanted to admit. This wasn't the same girl who had once shared everything with him. This wasn't the daughter he had grown to know and love. This version of Emily was someone he didn't recognize, someone who seemed to be shutting him out more and more every day. I know this is hard. But I need you to talk to me. You know you can always talk to me, right? Jake asked, his voice laced with concern. Emily bit her lip, and for a moment, Jake thought she might actually say something. But instead, she looked away, her eyes dark with emotions she wasn't ready to share. I'm fine, Dad. You don't need to worry about me, she said quietly, almost too quietly, before turning on her heel and walking out of the room. Jake's heart sank. He had spent so much time worrying about her, trying to protect her from the fallout of the divorce and Sarah's affair, but maybe, just maybe, he was the one who needed to protect her from himself. From his own fears and his own pain. He had never realized just how much his kids were internalizing. Emily was struggling in her own way, trying to be strong, not wanting to burden him with her feelings. But Jake knew all too well that burying emotions didn't make them go away. They festered. And eventually, they exploded. The next morning, as Jake prepared breakfast for the kids, he found Liam sitting at the kitchen table, his face buried in a book. Unlike his sister, Liam was never one to voice his struggles, but there was something in his demeanor, his tight posture, the way he kept glancing up at Jake, that made Jake uneasy. Hey, buddy. How's everything going? Jake asked, trying to sound casual. Liam shrugged, not looking up from his book. Okay, I guess. Jake sat down across from him, his hands resting on the table, searching for the right words. He knew Liam better than anyone, knew that he needed a nudge to get him to open up, to let the emotions flow. But Jake wasn't sure how much more of this he could take. His heart ached as he thought about how much his son had already been through. The divorce. His mom's affair. Everything was piling up on him, and Jake couldn't help but wonder just how much more his kids could bear. Liam, if you ever want to talk about anything, you know I'm here for you, right? Jake asked softly. Liam didn't respond right away. Instead, he closed the book with a soft thud and met his father's eyes for the first time that morning. Jake could see the confusion, the hurt, the anger there, so much like what he was feeling himself. Yeah, I know, Liam said quietly. He paused, then added, but I don't know what to say. Everything's messed up, Dad. I don't get it. Why is all this happening? Jake leaned forward, his heart breaking for his son. I know, son. I don't get it either. It's hard. It's hard for me, too. But we'll figure it out, okay? We're going to get through this together. You don't have to understand everything right now. You don't have to have all the answers. But I'm here for you. Always. Liam didn't say anything else. He just nodded, looking down at his hands, and for a moment, Jake saw that small glimmer of the boy he used to know. The boy who would play catch with him, who would come to him for advice, who would laugh at silly jokes. That boy hadn't disappeared completely. But the road to healing would be long, and Jake knew they couldn't rush it. Later that day, when Jake was in the living room, going over some legal papers related to the divorce, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Sarah. Jake, we need to talk. There are things that need to be said, things I never had the courage to tell you. Can we meet tomorrow? Jake stared at the message for a long time, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. A part of him wanted to ignore it, wanted to shut down and move forward without ever hearing Sarah's explanation. But another part of him, the part that still clung to the idea that closure could help him move on, knew that he had to meet with her. He had to face the pain head-on. With a sigh, Jake typed back, his hands shaking slightly. Okay. Tomorrow. Let's meet. The next day, Jake found himself sitting across from Sarah at a small cafe. The tension between them was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Sarah looked tired, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She was dressed simply, her once lively spirit now a faint shadow of what it used to be. I'm sorry, Sarah began, her voice low and shaky. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't want any of this to happen. But I was scared, Jake. Scared of losing everything, scared of losing myself. And I made a huge mistake. A mistake that cost me everything. Jake clenched his jaw, his emotions raw. You cost me my family, Sarah. You didn't just make a mistake. You betrayed me. And you've hurt the kids, too. They're not okay. I don't know if they ever will be. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't speak for a moment. When she finally looked up at him, there was a depth of regret in her gaze. I know, she whispered. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I can. But I need you to know that I am truly sorry, Jake. For everything. Jake stared at her, his heart torn between anger and sorrow. He wanted to yell at her, to demand more answers, but a part of him understood. They were both broken, both lost in the wreckage of their marriage. Neither of them had the answers, and perhaps that was the hardest part. I just want the kids to be okay, Jake said, his voice cracking. I want to fix this for them. I know, Sarah replied softly. I want that too. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their past hanging in the air, unspoken but present. Neither of them had the power to undo what had been done. They could only move forward, with all the scars and mistakes in tow. And for the first time in a long time, Jake wondered if there was still hope for healing, for himself, for Emily and Liam, and for the fractured family they used to be. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The past would always be with them. It would shape their future, but it wouldn't define it. Not if Jake had anything to say about it. The next few days felt like a blur. After meeting with Sarah, Jake found himself struggling to make sense of the conversation. It hadn't provided him with all the answers he had hoped for, but it did give him something he hadn't expected, a glimmer of understanding. Sarah wasn't looking for forgiveness, at least not in the way he thought. She was simply acknowledging the pain she'd caused, and that acknowledgement, though painful, was a step forward. Still, Jake couldn't help but feel conflicted. A part of him wanted to throw himself into his kids' lives, to make up for the lost time and to be the rock they needed. But another part of him felt like he was standing on the edge of something bigger, a moment in which everything he thought he knew about his life was in flux. The past was weighing heavily on him, and moving forward felt like an insurmountable task. Jake tried to focus on the little things, the daily routines that kept him grounded. He made breakfast for Emily and Liam, even though they barely spoke. He drove them to school and picked them up, attempting small conversations that usually fell flat. He tried to keep things normal, even when his heart wasn't in it. One evening, a week after his meeting with Sarah, Jake found himself alone in the living room, watching the kids as they interacted. Emily sat on the couch, lost in her phone, while Liam sat cross-legged on the floor, absorbed in a video game. The house was quiet, but there was an underlying tension, like a storm waiting to break. Jake felt it, too, the unspoken emotions that lingered between them. Sighing, he stood up and walked over to Emily, sitting down beside her. She didn't look up at him, but he could feel her presence, her energy. "Hey," Jake said gently, "how are you really doing?" Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression guarded. She didn't answer right away, instead scrolling through her phone as if it were a way to avoid the conversation. But Jake wasn't going to let it slide this time. I know you're struggling. I can see it," he pressed, his voice softer now. "I just want to help. I know things aren't the same as they used to be, but you're still my little girl. And I'm still here for you, no matter what." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, almost as if it were a release, Emily put her phone down and looked at him. Her eyes were filled with a quiet pain, the kind of pain that comes from holding everything in for too long. "I don't know what to say, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know how to feel anymore. I'm just so tired of everything being so messed up." Jake's heart broke at her words, and he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I get it, honey. I really do. But we can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not. It's okay to feel what you're feeling. I want to help you through it, okay? Emily nodded slowly, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. She didn't cry, though, she just looked at him, her face a mixture of confusion and sorrow. I don't want things to be this way, she whispered. I don't want everything to be falling apart. Jake swallowed hard. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing, they couldn't continue like this. They couldn't continue pretending like nothing had changed. They needed to confront the pain head-on, as a family. We're going to work through this together, Em. We're going to make things better. It's not going to be easy, but we'll get there, Jake said, his voice firm but gentle. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily didn't respond immediately, but there was a small shift in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jake believe that, maybe, just maybe, they could find their way through this storm. Later that evening, Jake sat down with Liam in the kitchen while they had dinner. Liam had been quieter than usual, and Jake could sense that something was on his mind. Hey, buddy, Jake began, trying to keep his tone light, how's everything at school? Liam shrugged, taking a bite of his food. Same as always. Just school stuff. Jake studied him for a moment, sensing that Liam was holding something back. He wasn't sure what it was, maybe it was the weight of everything going on, or maybe it was just typical Liam, but Jake felt the need to push a little more. You know, if you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here, Jake said gently. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers, but I want to be there for you. Liam didn't say anything at first, his gaze fixed on his plate. But then, after a few moments, he looked up at his father. I don't know what to say, Dad, Liam said quietly. It's just all been so weird. I miss how things used to be. I miss when we were all a family. Jake's throat tightened, the rawness in Liam's voice hitting him harder than he expected. He had known his son was struggling, but hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality of it all even more real. I miss that too, buddy, Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. Things aren't the same, and I don't know if they ever will be. But that doesn't mean we can't find a new way forward. We'll figure this out. Together. Liam nodded, though it was clear that he still didn't quite believe it. But Jake wasn't giving up. He couldn't. His kids needed him, and despite everything that had happened, he wasn't about to let them slip away. As the evening wore on, Jake felt a strange sense of resolve beginning to settle in him. The pain, the hurt, it was all still there, just beneath the surface. But it didn't have to define him. It didn't have to define his kids. They could move forward, no matter how daunting the road ahead seemed. The first step had been confronting the pain, allowing it to be felt instead of buried. Now, it was time to take the next step. Jake wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew this much, he wouldn't be facing it alone. And maybe that was enough for now. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about Sarah, the divorce, the lies, and the fractured family that had once felt unbreakable. And then, he thought about Emily and Liam. Their faces, filled with confusion and pain, but also with a flicker of hope that maybe things could change. Maybe they could find a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Jake believed it, too. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew that a new chapter was beginning. One step at a time, they would rebuild. Jake awoke the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was still early, and the first rays of sunlight were barely breaking through the curtains. Groggily, he reached over and grabbed the phone. It was a text from Emily. Dad, I need to talk to you about something. Can you meet me in the living room when you wake up? Jake sat up straight in bed, his heart skipping a beat. Emily had been distant lately, so any message from her was a rare event, and the tone of the text sent a chill down his spine. What was going on? Was she okay? He quickly checked the time. It was still early, but he didn't want to waste a second. He threw on a t-shirt and walked to the living room, where Emily was sitting on the couch, a piece of paper clutched tightly in her hands. She was staring down at it, her expression unreadable. "Hey, Em," Jake said softly, walking over to her. "What's going on?" Emily didn't look up immediately. Instead, she let out a shaky breath, almost as if she was trying to gather her thoughts. Finally, she glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "I found something, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I think it might help us understand everything that's been happening." Jake's heart raced. "What did you find?" Emily handed him the letter, her fingers trembling as she released her grip on it. It was a simple white envelope, but there was something about the way she handed it to him that made it feel significant. Jake carefully opened the envelope, his mind racing as he pulled out the folded piece of paper inside. It was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Liam. Jake blinked, his mind trying to process the meaning of what he was holding. Why had Liam written a letter? And why was Emily the one to find it? "I didn't mean to snoop," Emily quickly explained, her eyes wide with guilt. "But I found it in Liam's room when I was cleaning up. I didn't know what it was, and then I saw his name on it, and I had to read it." Jake glanced down at the letter, and with a deep breath, he began to read. "Dad. I don't know how to say this, but I need you to know how I feel. Everything's been so messed up lately, and I don't know how to talk to you about it. I'm scared that if I say the wrong thing, it'll make everything worse. But I need to say it, because I don't think you know how bad things really are for me. I miss Mom. I miss how things used to be. I miss feeling like everything was okay. But most of all, I miss you. I know you're trying your best, but I don't know if you see it. It feels like you're just doing everything for Emily, and I'm not sure where I fit in anymore. I know you love me, but I can't help but feel like I'm invisible sometimes. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to feel. And I don't know how to make this stop. I want things to be normal again. But I don't think they ever will be. I just want to be okay, and I don't know how to do that. Please don't be mad at me for writing this. I just need you to know. Liam." Jake's heart sank as he read the words. They were so raw, so honest. He had never realized just how deeply Liam was hurting. He had been so focused on his own pain, on trying to make things right with Sarah and Emily, that he had overlooked his son's quiet struggle. He looked up from the letter, and Emily was staring at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Dad, I didn't mean to invade his privacy," Emily said quickly, her voice shaking. "But I thought you needed to know. I thought we all needed to know." Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had always known that Liam was the quieter one, the one who kept everything inside, but this letter revealed a side of him that Jake had never fully understood. Liam wasn't just struggling with the divorce, he was struggling with feeling like he was being left behind. He was scared, and he didn't know how to say it. Jake sat down next to Emily, putting an arm around her shoulders. He felt like he was on the edge of something huge, something that could change everything for their family. He realized that, in his attempt to be strong, to hold everything together, he had been missing the signs. He had failed to see how much his son needed him. "It's not your fault, Em," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't invade his privacy. You did the right thing. We need to understand what's going on. We can't fix it if we don't know what's broken." Emily wiped her eyes, sniffling. "I just don't know what to do, Dad. Everything's falling apart. I don't know how to fix it." Jake took a deep breath, staring down at the letter again. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He knew it wasn't going to be a quick fix. But at least now, they had something to start with. They had the truth, Liam's truth. And that was a step in the right direction. We're going to work through this, Em. Together. We're going to start by talking to Liam. He needs to know we're here for him. He needs to know he's not alone. Emily nodded, still looking unsure. But what if he doesn't want to talk? What if he just shuts us out like he's been doing? Jake squeezed her shoulder. We'll take it one step at a time. We don't have all the answers, but we have each other. That's enough. Emily managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She seemed to take comfort in his words, but Jake knew it was going to take more than just words. They had to start rebuilding the trust, the connection that had been strained over the past few months. Later that day, Jake sat down with Liam in his room, the weight of the letter still heavy in his hands. He had to approach this carefully, knowing that Liam was a child who struggled to express his feelings. But it was time to stop avoiding the hard conversations. It was time to start healing. Liam, Jake began, his voice soft but firm, I read the letter. And I want you to know that I'm really sorry. I didn't know you were feeling this way. I didn't realize how much you were struggling. Liam didn't look at him at first. He kept his head down, his hands clenched in his lap. It's okay, Dad, Liam muttered, his voice small. I don't need you to fix it. I don't know what to do anymore. Jake sat beside him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. We don't have to fix it all at once. But we're going to start by talking about it. And we're going to get through it, okay? Together. Liam looked up at him then, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know how. Jake smiled softly, his heart swelling with love and relief. That's okay. We'll figure it out. One step at a time. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like they were on the right path. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But they had taken the first step toward healing. And that, he realized, was all they really needed to start a new beginning. The weeks following the discovery of Liam's letter were a blur of emotions, small victories, and inevitable setbacks. Jake had hoped that after reading the letter, everything would start to make sense, that things would click back into place and the family would be able to heal. But healing wasn't that simple, and the cracks that had formed over the past year weren't going to vanish overnight. Jake tried to be more present. He worked hard to show Emily and Liam that he was there for them, that he was committed to being a better father. But there was still a wall between them, one that was difficult to break down. He could see it in the way they interacted, small, hesitant gestures, half-formed conversations, the lingering tension that hovered in the air like a fog. At night, when the house was quiet and the kids were in bed, Jake would sit on the couch, reflecting on the distance between them. It was as if they were all trying to navigate this new, fragile version of their family, unsure of where the next step should lead. They had all been affected by the divorce, by the pain, and by the way everything had fractured. They couldn't just go back to what it had been before. No matter how hard they tried, the past was a shadow they couldn't outrun. But Jake didn't give up. He couldn't. For Emily and Liam, he pushed forward, determined to create something new, something that wasn't defined by their past. It was during one of these quiet moments, while he was sitting alone on the couch, that the phone rang. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the name on the screen, Sarah. He hesitated for a moment before answering. It had been a few weeks since they'd last spoken, and their conversations had been rare, reserved. Sarah had been focused on her own healing, and Jake was still trying to figure out where he stood in their new, uncertain world. Hello. Jake answered, his voice unsure. Jake, it's me, Sarah's voice came through the phone, a touch of hesitation in her tone. I've been thinking a lot about the kids, and about everything. Jake's heart tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. What's on your mind? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I think we need to talk, Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. About the divorce. About how we're co-parenting, how we're moving forward. I know it hasn't been easy, and I know we've been, distant. But the kids are struggling, Jake. And I think we need to figure this out for them. Jake nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He had been expecting this conversation for a while. They both knew that their relationship had become strained, but the kids' well-being had to come first. I agree, he said, his voice heavy. It's been tough. For all of us. But I'm trying, Sarah. I'm trying to be there for them, to help them through this. I know you are, Sarah said, a soft sigh escaping her lips. But it's not just about being there, Jake. We need to make sure they feel secure. We need to make sure they're not caught in the middle of everything. Jake felt a pang in his chest. He understood what she was saying, but it wasn't as easy as just making things right. The pain of the divorce, the hurt they had both caused each other, it wasn't something they could fix with just a conversation. They needed time, they needed trust. And that was the hardest part. Are you saying, you want to try again? Jake asked, his voice tentative. He didn't know if he was ready for that. The thought of rekindling something that had fallen apart felt like stepping into the unknown. Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. No, Jake. I'm not saying we should try again. I think we both know that's not going to happen. But we need to be better co-parents. We need to make sure we're doing everything we can to help the kids adjust, to help them understand that they're still loved, that this isn't their fault. Jake let out a breath, relieved but also disappointed. He had been holding on to the idea of reconciliation, even though he knew deep down it wasn't realistic. But co-parenting, that was something they could try. It wouldn't be easy, but it was something they could do together, for the kids. I agree, Jake said after a long pause. We can do that. We can work together for them. We just have to be honest with each other, and we have to keep them out of the middle of things. It's the least we can do. Sarah's voice softened. I know. And Jake. I'm sorry. For everything. Jake felt a wave of emotion wash over him, the weight of everything they had been through settling on his shoulders. He had never imagined that this would be the outcome of their marriage, but he had to admit, in that moment, he was grateful for the apology. It wasn't about fixing everything, it was about moving forward with a sense of respect and understanding. I'm sorry too, Sarah, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. For the hurt I caused you, for the mistakes I made. We both have our part in this. There was a long silence before Sarah spoke again. I'll send over the schedule for the kids' activities this weekend. We can figure out a time to meet and talk more, if you want. Jake nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. That sounds good. They hung up shortly after that, and Jake sat in the stillness of the living room, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He had expected things to feel easier, but the reality of co-parenting, of navigating a relationship built on so much pain, was more complicated than he could have imagined. But it was a step in the right direction. It had to be. For the kids. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jake stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom. He studied his reflection, looking at the man staring back at him. He didn't recognize him as well as he used to. His face was older, more tired. But there was something else, something in his eyes. A sense of purpose. A sense of resolve. He was no longer the man who had let his life fall apart. He was someone who had learned from his mistakes, who was ready to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But he was willing to fight for his family, for the future, for the chance to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important thing of all. The next few days passed slowly, each one feeling like a small, measured step towards something better. Jake found himself mulling over the conversation with Sarah, replaying it in his mind. They hadn't promised to fix everything in one go, but the clarity they had reached about co-parenting had given him a sense of relief. It wasn't about them as a couple anymore, it was about doing what was best for their children. But things weren't perfect, and Jake knew that. Not by a long shot. He still hadn't had a real conversation with Liam about the letter. After Emily had shown it to him, they had both agreed not to push Liam too much. But Jake knew they couldn't ignore the underlying issues. He had to find a way to talk to his son. One evening, after dinner, as they were cleaning up the kitchen, Jake found himself alone with Liam. Emily had gone to her room, and it was just the two of them, the quiet hum of the dishwasher filling the space between them. "Liam," Jake began, his voice tentative, "we need to talk." Liam paused in the middle of wiping down the counter, his eyes darting to Jake, then back to the cloth in his hand. He didn't respond immediately, as if trying to decide whether he wanted to hear what Jake had to say. "I read your letter," Jake continued softly, stepping closer to his son. "And I just want you to know that I'm really sorry. I didn't realize how much you were struggling. I didn't see it." Liam looked up then, his eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and hurt. "It's not your fault, Dad," he muttered. "I didn't tell you. I didn't know how to." Jake's heart broke at the words. It wasn't just about the letter. It was about how much Liam had been holding in, how much he had been carrying on his own for so long. The weight of the divorce, of everything falling apart, had been too much for a boy his age to process, let alone express. "I should have known," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been paying closer attention. You don't have to keep everything inside, Liam. You can talk to me. I want to help. I want you to know you're not alone in this." Liam was silent for a moment, his hands still frozen around the cloth. He looked like he was weighing his options, unsure of what to say next. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "It's just, everything's been different," Liam said, his voice cracking. "I don't even know what to do anymore. I miss Mom. I miss how things used to be. And I feel like you're always focused on Emily now. You never have time for me." Jake felt a pang of guilt. He knew he had been more focused on Emily lately, trying to rebuild their connection after everything that had happened. But he also knew that he had neglected Liam in the process. He had been so caught up in trying to fix the broken pieces of his own life that he hadn't noticed how much his son was struggling. "I'm sorry, Liam," Jake said, his voice firm. "I know I've made mistakes. I've been so focused on Emily and trying to make things right that I haven't been there for you the way I should have. But I want to change that. I want to be there for you, just like I've been there for her." Liam shrugged, looking away as if he was trying to hide the emotions he didn't want to show. "I don't know if I believe that," he said softly. "You've been so distant, Dad. And I don't know how to make it stop." Jake's heart sank. He had known that this wouldn't be easy. He had known that rebuilding trust would take time. But hearing the pain in Liam's voice made it feel more real, more urgent. He couldn't ignore it any longer. "Liam, I'm sorry. I know I've been distant. But I need you to know something, this isn't your fault. I've been caught up in my own mess, trying to fix everything, and I lost sight of what really matters. You matter. You always have." Liam was quiet for a long time, his eyes focused on the floor. Jake couldn't tell what he was thinking, but he could see the wheels turning behind his son's eyes. Finally, Liam spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I just don't want to be forgotten, Dad. I don't want to feel like I'm invisible." Jake's heart twisted in his chest. He had never realized just how deeply his son had been feeling that way. Invisible. It was a word that cut right to the core of his failure as a father. He had tried so hard to be there for both of his kids, but he had fallen short. And now, it was up to him to fix it. To rebuild the bridge that had slowly eroded between them. "You're not invisible, Liam," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise. I'm here. I'm always going to be here for you. I know I've messed up, but I'm going to do better. We can get through this. Together." Liam didn't say anything, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. It was a small step, but it was something. It was more than he had expected. "I know you're going through a lot right now," Jake added, trying to break the silence. "But I want you to know that you don't have to go through it alone. We can talk. We can figure this out, okay?" Liam nodded slowly, his eyes still downcast. It wasn't a declaration of trust, but it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, he was willing to try. The rest of the evening was quiet, but there was a shift in the atmosphere between them. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a solution to all their problems. But it was progress. And that's all Jake could ask for. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, he thought about everything that had been said. It wasn't the first conversation he had had with Liam, but it was the first real one. The first honest exchange where they both spoke openly about their pain, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Jake knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But he also knew that as long as they kept talking, kept working together, they could rebuild the trust that had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, they could start to heal. But first, they had to face the truth. And that was something Jake was finally ready to do. A week had passed since that pivotal conversation with Liam, and Jake was still reeling from the emotional weight of it all. It was the kind of conversation that peeled back layers of a relationship, raw, vulnerable, and often painful. But something had shifted in their dynamic. It wasn't a perfect change, but it was the start of something better, something Jake could hold on to. Though the gap between him and Liam had begun to close, Jake could feel the tension still lingering in the air. It wasn't just between them. It was between everyone. He hadn't spoken to Sarah much since their last phone call, but he knew that the real work was only just beginning. They were still figuring out how to navigate their new normal, what their relationship as co-parents would look like moving forward. On the surface, things seemed to be getting better. Emily had started spending more time with Liam, and there were fewer moments of silence between them. The kids had even started laughing together again, a sound Jake had missed more than he realized. But underneath it all, the discomfort of the changes they were experiencing remained. It was like a subtle hum in the background, constant, unavoidable, and never truly gone. One afternoon, Jake sat in the small park near his house, watching Emily and Liam play basketball on the half-court. He had promised both of them he would be there for the small things, the everyday moments. He had learned that it was the little moments, the seemingly insignificant ones, that truly mattered. So, there he sat on the bench, giving them space to enjoy the game, but also offering his presence. It was in those quiet moments that Jake had the chance to reflect, to think about how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. There was a part of him that still felt like a stranger in his own family. He wanted so desperately to be a better father, to make things right for the kids. But no matter how hard he tried, the feeling of disconnect lingered. "Hey, Dad. Pass it." Liam called from across the court, waving his hands in the air. Jake stood up, his heart warming at the sight of his son actively engaging with him, even if it was just a simple game of basketball. It was something. He jogged over to the court, ready to join them. "All right, I'm coming in," Jake said, grinning as he picked up the ball from the ground. He dribbled a couple of times before tossing it to Liam. "You're gonna regret that," Liam teased, his face lighting up as he dashed towards the hoop. Jake couldn't help but laugh. This was the side of Liam that had been buried for so long, the playful, carefree child who had always loved basketball. For a moment, everything felt normal again, like the last few months of tension and heartbreak had never happened. But as they played, Jake noticed something he hadn't expected. Emily, who had been watching from the sidelines, was standing with her arms crossed, her face set in a tight expression. He could tell she was watching the game, but there was something off about the way she was standing. Jake hesitated, then jogged over to her. "Hey, Em," he said softly, trying to gauge her mood. "You all right?" She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she shrugged, her eyes briefly flickering toward Liam and back to him. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice distant. "Just watching." Jake didn't buy it. He knew something was bothering her, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface. Emily hadn't been herself lately, quiet, withdrawn, like she was carrying something heavy that she didn't want to share. It reminded him too much of how he had been in the past. "Emily," Jake said gently, taking a step closer. "You know you can talk to me, right? If something's wrong." She hesitated for a long time, then finally let out a sigh, her shoulders slumping. "It's not about the game," she said quietly. "It's about everything. I just don't feel like you're really here, Dad. Not with me. Not with us." Jake's heart dropped. It was exactly what he had feared but hadn't wanted to admit. He had been so focused on Liam, so wrapped up in trying to fix his relationship with him, that he hadn't noticed how distant he had become from Emily. He had assumed that if Liam was okay, everything else would fall into place. But Emily had been silently carrying the weight of everything, too. "I'm sorry," Jake said softly, guilt flooding his chest. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I've been so focused on getting things right with Liam, I forgot about you." Emily shook her head, her expression pained. "It's not just that. I get it, I do. I know I'm not as difficult to deal with as Liam, but I need you, too. We both do. I'm scared that we're losing you, Dad." Her words cut deeper than Jake could have expected. The idea of losing Emily, too, made his heart ache. He had spent so much time focused on trying to fix things with one child, that he hadn't realized how his neglect was affecting the other. He had been there physically, but emotionally, he had pulled away. He had failed to see that both of his children were struggling in their own ways. Jake stepped closer to Emily, his voice soft. "I'm so sorry, Em. I've been blind to how much you're hurting, too. I promise you, I'll do better. I'll be here, for both of you." Emily's eyes softened, but she still didn't fully look at him. "I just need you to be here, Dad. Not just physically. I need to know you're really trying, that you're really seeing me." Jake felt the weight of her words sink in. "I will, Emily. I will. I'll make time. We'll do things together, just you and me. No distractions. We'll figure this out." For the first time in a long while, Emily gave him a small, tentative smile. "Okay. I'll hold you to that." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The road ahead was still long, but this was a start. It wasn't the end, but it was a turning point. He could already feel the change in the air. His relationship with Emily was something that needed just as much attention as his relationship with Liam. He couldn't afford to neglect either of them. As they stood there together, watching Liam finish his game, Jake realized something important. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard. He had made mistakes, and he would make more. But the key was to keep trying, to keep being there, no matter how difficult the journey. And with that realization, Jake knew he could do it. He could be the father they both needed. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the man he had always hoped to become. The next few weeks passed in a blur, filled with small victories and setbacks. Jake had begun to rebuild his relationship with Emily, just as he had worked on strengthening his bond with Liam. It wasn't easy, but the effort was beginning to pay off. They had started to do things together, small activities, like movie nights, cooking dinner, and even just talking more openly. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes, it was about consistency. About showing up, every day, in the ways that mattered. But as the days went by, Jake couldn't help but notice that there was still something unresolved in their household. Despite the progress he'd made with the kids, there was a heavy silence that lingered between him and Sarah. They had barely spoken since the last conversation they'd had, where they agreed to try and co-parent without involving old wounds. But the truth was, the walls between them hadn't come down completely. Jake knew they needed to have another conversation. It was inevitable. They had been parents together for years, but the dynamic of their relationship had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. Co-parenting was proving to be much more complicated than they'd originally thought. And it wasn't just about their kids anymore. It was about them, about how they moved forward, how they would navigate the mess of their past, and how they would build a new relationship that was healthy for everyone involved. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jake decided to take the first step. He found Sarah in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The silence between them was thick, but he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice breaking through the quiet, "we need to talk." She turned toward him, her eyes cautious but not unkind. "About what?" "About us," Jake replied, taking a deep breath. "About the way we're co-parenting. About the way we're living in this house. I think we need to make sure we're both on the same page, for the kids." Sarah set down the dish she was holding and looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "Okay. We can talk." Jake wasn't sure where to start. They had been through so much together, and the weight of their past was still heavy on both of them. But they had to make this work. For the kids. For themselves. "I know we've both been doing our best," Jake began, choosing his words carefully. "But it feels like we're still tiptoeing around each other. Like we're afraid to really talk. And I don't want to keep living like that." Sarah crossed her arms over her chest, looking thoughtful. "I agree. I don't want things to be this way either. But, Jake, you've changed. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I don't know. I feel like I don't know you anymore." Jake winced at her words. He knew she wasn't saying it out of spite, but it still stung. "I've changed, yeah. I've had to. I've been trying to figure things out. I've been focused on the kids, on making sure they're okay, and I guess I've neglected the fact that I need to be better with you too." Sarah sighed, her shoulders dropping. "I get that. I really do. But you've been so focused on being a good father, Jake, that I feel like I'm just not a part of the equation anymore." Jake's heart tightened as he realized the truth of her words. She was right. He had been so wrapped up in repairing his relationship with Liam and Emily, so consumed with being there for them, that he had let his relationship with Sarah slip into the background. He hadn't been there for her the way she needed. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with remorse. "I didn't mean for you to feel that way. I've been so caught up in fixing things that I didn't realize I was leaving you out." Sarah's gaze softened, and she took a step closer to him. "I'm not blaming you. I just need to know that you see me. That we're in this together. I want to be part of the family, not just the background." Jake nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. "I do see you, Sarah. I do. I've just been so focused on the kids that I lost sight of how much we still need to heal as well." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but rather, it was filled with unspoken understanding. There was so much to unpack between them, the years of their marriage, the hurt they had both caused, and the hope they still clung to. They weren't ready to fix everything in one conversation, but it was a start. A very important start. "I think we need to be better at communicating," Sarah said softly, her eyes meeting his. "Not just for the kids, but for us. We need to figure out how to move forward. And maybe that means taking things slowly. One day at a time." Jake nodded, his heart aching but hopeful. "I agree. I want to make this work. I want to rebuild everything. But I also want to make sure that we don't lose sight of us, of who we were, and who we are now." Sarah smiled faintly, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. "It's going to take time, Jake. But I think we can do it." Together. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and bumps along the way. But this was a turning point, a moment where they had both acknowledged their need for change and growth. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It was about starting over, one step at a time. As the conversation faded into the quiet of the night, Jake realized that he wasn't just rebuilding his relationship with his kids. He was also rebuilding his relationship with Sarah. It wouldn't be easy. It might even be messy. But for the first time in a while, he was ready to face whatever came next. And maybe, just maybe, they could all find their way back to each other, stronger, wiser, and more united than before. It had been a few months since Jake and Sarah had that pivotal conversation. The changes in their household were subtle but undeniable. The tension that had once lingered in every corner of their home had softened, replaced by a growing sense of understanding. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of disagreement, still times when they felt like they were walking on eggshells. But there was progress. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. Jake had taken the time to really listen to Sarah, to understand her needs and fears, just as he had done with Liam and Emily. He learned to balance his focus, giving equal weight to all his relationships, his children and Sarah alike. It hadn't been easy. There were days when the exhaustion of trying to repair so much felt overwhelming. But the small moments of connection, the quiet conversations after the kids went to bed, reminded him that it was all worth it. Liam, for his part, had continued to open up, letting Jake in on his world in a way he hadn't before. Their bond was stronger than ever, though Jake knew it would take time for Liam to fully trust again. But the fact that Liam was coming to him for advice, for guidance, filled Jake with hope. Emily, too, had become more comfortable with him. She had always been the more independent one, but there were moments when she sought him out, asking for his thoughts or just wanting to spend time with him. It was those small moments that reminded Jake that he was doing the right thing, even if it didn't always feel like it. The household was beginning to feel like a home again, one filled with laughter, shared meals, and conversations that didn't feel so heavy. There was a new rhythm to their lives, a routine that, while still new and a little tentative, held the promise of something better. Jake wasn't under any illusions. He knew that healing didn't happen in a straight line. There would be setbacks, hard days, and moments where the past would try to resurface. But he was ready to face it, with his family by his side. One Saturday afternoon, as Jake and Sarah sat on the back porch, sipping coffee and watching the kids play in the yard, he felt a rare sense of peace. It had been a long road, filled with emotional roller coasters and difficult decisions, but in this moment, it felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. "I never thought we'd get here," Sarah said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I really didn't." Jake looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Me neither," he admitted. "But I think we're finally starting to get it right. At least, we're trying." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant but warm. "I'm proud of us. Proud of the kids, too. They've been through so much, and they're doing better. I think we're all healing." Jake reached over and squeezed her hand, the gesture simple but filled with meaning. "Yeah. It's not perfect, but it's ours." They sat there for a while, watching the kids laugh and chase each other around the yard. Liam was trying to teach Emily how to shoot hoops, while she rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed with his coaching. It was a beautiful sight, the kind of ordinary moment that felt extraordinary after everything they had been through. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't tried to fix things?" Sarah asked, her voice contemplative. Jake considered the question for a moment, his gaze fixed on the kids. "I think we'd be farther apart. Maybe we'd be coexisting, but we wouldn't be truly living together. We wouldn't be a family. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm glad we've been able to start over." "I am too," Sarah said, her tone softer now. "I think we're finally seeing each other again. Not just as parents or partners, but as people." It wasn't an easy thing to do, seeing each other as people first, before the labels of husband and wife, mom and dad. But it was something Jake had learned through this journey, that they had both been so focused on the roles they played, on being the perfect parents or the perfect exes, that they had forgotten to just be themselves, to let each other in as individuals. It was the kind of vulnerability that was hard to embrace but so necessary for healing. As the day wore on, the kids eventually tired themselves out and retreated to the house, leaving Jake and Sarah alone on the porch once more. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the yard. Jake looked at Sarah, a sense of quiet gratitude filling him. "You know," Jake said, his voice low, "I think we've done a good job. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. We've done that." Sarah smiled, a genuine, tired smile that reflected everything they had been through and everything they had yet to face. "We've done more than that. We've started over. Together." Jake nodded, his heart full. They weren't the same people they had been when this all started, and that was a good thing. They had been broken, yes, but they had rebuilt themselves, brick by brick, moment by moment. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth it. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt hopeful for what the future held. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be moments when they stumbled, when the past crept in to remind them of their mistakes. But they had learned something valuable along the way. They had learned to forgive, not just each other, but themselves. And that was the most important step of all. As they sat in silence, the last light of day fading from the sky, Jake realized that they weren't just a family trying to survive. They were a family who had found a way to thrive, together. And that was more than he could have ever hoped for. The following week brought with it a new sense of possibility. The house was quieter, more peaceful, but there was still an underlying current of anticipation in the air. Jake could feel it, something was coming, something was about to shift once again. He just didn't know what it was. It started with a simple moment. One evening, after dinner, as Jake was cleaning up the dishes, Emily appeared at the kitchen doorway. She wasn't one to seek him out unless it was something important, so Jake turned to look at her, puzzled. "Hey, Em," he greeted with a smile. "What's up?" Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, holding something tightly in her hands. It was a letter, folded neatly and sealed with care. Her fingers were wrapped around it like she was unsure whether to let it go or hold on to it forever. "Dad," she began, her voice quiet, "I found this in Liam's room." Jake's brow furrowed. Emily had always been the more cautious one, but this was something different. She looked at the letter, then at him, waiting for him to take it. Slowly, Jake stepped forward and took the letter from her, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "What is it?" he asked, already knowing this wasn't a typical piece of mail. "I don't know," Emily answered, shaking her head. But it looked important. Like he didn't want anyone to find it. Jake's mind raced as he examined the letter. It was addressed simply to "Dad," with no return address or stamp. He felt a tightness in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to open it right away. Instead, he looked at Emily, who was watching him intently. "I'll take care of it," he said gently, placing the letter on the counter. "Thank you for bringing it to me." Emily nodded and left the kitchen without another word, but Jake remained standing there for a moment, staring at the letter. What could it possibly contain? Why had Liam been hiding it? And why had Emily found it? His mind raced through all the possibilities, all the things that could be inside. After a few moments, Jake took a deep breath and unfolded the letter carefully. His hands trembled slightly as he read. "Dear Dad. I know I haven't been easy to deal with lately. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've kept things from you. But I need you to understand something I'm not ready to say out loud. Mom told me once that you and her never really finished what you started. That there were things left unsaid, things you didn't know how to deal with. I don't think I fully understood what she meant, but I do now. I see it. I see how much you've been trying to fix everything, how much you've been trying to make things better for us. But I also see how much you're hurting. How much you're pretending to be okay, when I know you're not. I've been holding on to something that's been eating at me for a while. It's not just about Mom and the divorce. It's about everything. It's about the way things were before, the way we all were before everything fell apart. And I'm scared, Dad. I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared of losing this family. But I can't let that fear stop me from saying what I need to say. I need you to know that I forgive you. I forgive you for everything. For not being there when I needed you, for not knowing how to fix things, for everything that hurt me. I know you tried your best. I know you still are. And I need you to forgive me, too. Because I've been angry. So angry. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been keeping everything in. I've been pretending like I'm okay, like nothing bothers me, but it does. It all does. And I don't know how to make it stop. But I want to. I want to start over, just like you're trying to. I want us to be okay again. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but I think this is the first step. I hope you understand. I hope you don't hate me for writing this. I just wanted you to know how I feel. Love. Liam. Jake's heart felt like it was in his throat as he read the last lines of the letter. The room seemed to close in around him as a wave of emotion crashed over him. He could hardly believe what he had just read. It wasn't just an apology, it was a cry for connection, a desire for healing that both surprised and moved him. Liam, his son, had been carrying this weight all along. He had been angry, afraid, and hurt in ways Jake hadn't even fully understood. And now, here was his son, offering forgiveness and asking for it in return. Tears pricked at the corners of Jake's eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. He didn't want to break down right then and there. Not yet. But this letter was a turning point. It was the beginning of something Jake had longed for but hadn't known how to reach, true healing. Jake folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of Liam's words settling heavily on his heart. There was so much to process, so much to say in return. But he couldn't do it all at once. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, Jake walked over to the living room, where Liam was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. Liam looked up when Jake entered, his face a mix of apprehension and expectation. The air was thick with tension, but Jake was determined to face this. "Liam," Jake said, his voice steady but gentle, "can we talk?" Liam swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "About?" Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. "About this." Liam's eyes widened, and he looked away quickly, embarrassed. "Dad, I didn't." "Liam," Jake interrupted softly, "I want to talk about it. I want to hear what you wrote. And I want to tell you something, too." Liam nodded slowly, the weight of the moment clear on his face. He wasn't ready to speak yet, but Jake could see that his son was relieved that the time to confront the unspoken had finally arrived. And as Jake sat down next to him, he knew that this was the moment their family could begin to rebuild, truly and completely. It wasn't going to be easy, but with honesty and love, they could find their way back to each other. And maybe, just maybe, this letter was the key to unlocking a new chapter for them all. The days that followed the discovery of Liam's letter felt like they were suspended in time. Jake had expected a whirlwind of emotions, a flood of unresolved issues that would force everyone to confront their pasts in a chaotic rush. But instead, there was a strange calm that descended upon the house. It was as though a door had been opened, but the decision to walk through it was still theirs to make. Jake took the letter with him everywhere for the next few days. He read it over and over, each time discovering something new in Liam's words. The raw honesty, the quiet pain, the yearning for connection, it all weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just Liam seeking forgiveness. It was a cry for understanding, for a father to truly see him, to acknowledge everything he had been through. Sarah noticed the change in Jake almost immediately. He had always been a man of few words, but after reading that letter, something inside of him seemed to have shifted. He was more open, more present, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was finally ready to fully engage in this journey of healing they had both been trying so hard to navigate. That evening, after dinner, Jake called the family together in the living room. It was time. "Hey, guys," Jake began, his voice steady but tinged with an emotion he wasn't used to showing. He looked at Sarah first, then at Liam and Emily, who were both seated on the couch, looking back at him with curiosity. "I want to talk about something. Something that's been on my mind." The room fell silent. Even Emily, who was usually quick to crack a joke or change the subject, seemed to sense the weight of what was coming. Jake took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I found a letter. From Liam," he said, his eyes meeting his son's. "And I think it's time we all talk about what's been happening. Not just with the divorce, but with everything that's been going on in our lives. The hurt, the anger, the things we've been holding inside." Liam stiffened a little at the mention of the letter, but he didn't look away. He sat with his hands clenched in his lap, trying to hold his emotions at bay. Jake turned to Liam, his voice softer now. "I've read your letter, and I just want to say, I'm proud of you. For writing it. For being honest about how you feel. I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that I hear you." Liam swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had written the letter in a moment of vulnerability, and now, having his father acknowledge it, it felt both terrifying and relieving. I didn't know how else to say it, Dad," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't know if you'd even understand." Jake nodded slowly, his heart aching for the years of silence between them. "I understand more than you think," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand the anger, the frustration. I've been there, too. I haven't been perfect. But I want to do better. I want us to heal, together." There was a long pause as Liam absorbed his father's words. Slowly, he uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. I don't want things to stay the way they've been," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "I want us to be a family again. A real one. Not just people who share a house." Jake's heart swelled with emotion. It was exactly what he had been longing to hear, but he knew the journey wasn't going to be simple. There was so much to undo, so much to rebuild. Emily, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke up. "You know," she said, her voice steady and wise beyond her years, "it's not going to happen overnight. You guys can't just expect things to magically get better. But you're trying, and that's what matters." Jake smiled at his daughter, proud of the maturity she had shown in the face of everything that had happened. "You're right, Em," he agreed. "It's not going to happen overnight. But we're in this together. And that's the first step." Sarah, who had been watching silently, nodded in agreement. "We've all been through a lot. And it's going to take time. But we can't heal if we don't start talking, if we don't start really listening to each other." Liam looked between his parents and sister, a hesitant smile tugging at his lips. I guess I can try," he said. "I know I've been hard on you, Dad. And on Mom, too. But I don't want to keep fighting. I just want to move forward." Jake's eyes softened, and he leaned forward, his voice sincere. "I'm not going to make promises I can't keep. But I promise I'll keep trying. We all will." For the first time in a long time, the family felt united in their shared desire to heal. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a moment of understanding, of vulnerability. And that, Jake realized, was the beginning of something better. The following days were filled with small steps forward. Jake made a conscious effort to spend more time with each of his kids, engaging with them not as a father trying to fix everything, but as a parent who was learning to listen and be present. He took them out for weekend hikes, played basketball with Liam, and sat down with Emily to talk about her favorite books. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, consistently and without expectation. Sarah, too, made her own efforts. She and Jake had begun having more open conversations, not just about the kids, but about their own needs and hopes for the future. They didn't always agree, and there were moments when the old tensions resurfaced, but there was a shared understanding between them that hadn't been there before. They were partners in this, not just parents navigating the fallout of a broken marriage. Even the house began to feel different. The air was less heavy, the silence less oppressive. The laughter returned, gradually, like a distant memory reawakening. And though there were still many unanswered questions, Jake couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Healing, he realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one they would all have to walk together. And while the path was uncertain, with twists and turns they couldn't predict, they were no longer walking it alone. As the days turned into weeks, Jake felt himself begin to breathe more easily. There were still challenges ahead, still wounds that needed to heal. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance. And that was enough for now. The sun was beginning to set as Jake sat on the porch, looking out at the horizon. The days had been full of small moments of progress, each one a sign that the family was slowly but surely moving in the right direction. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that, Jake realized, was the best he could ask for. Liam was in the yard, tossing a ball back and forth with Emily, and for the first time in a long time, there was no tension in the air. No hidden resentments, no silent battles. Just laughter and the sound of kids being kids. Sarah, too, was outside, sitting at the table with a book in hand, her face relaxed as she watched the kids. The healing process had been gradual, and it wasn't without its setbacks. There were still days when the weight of everything felt heavy, when old wounds threatened to resurface. But they had learned something invaluable: it was okay to take things one step at a time. It was okay to not have all the answers. The important thing was that they were trying. Jake had learned to open up in ways he hadn't before. He wasn't perfect, but he was committed to being a better father, a better partner, and most importantly, a better version of himself. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something new, together. And Liam. Jake had seen a transformation in his son. He wasn't the angry, withdrawn teenager who had been so hard to reach. Now, Liam was more willing to talk, to share his thoughts, even if they weren't always easy to hear. He had stopped hiding behind walls, allowing himself to be vulnerable. And in return, Jake had stopped trying to control everything, learning instead to listen, to be present. It wasn't just Liam, though. Emily had blossomed too. She had always been the calm, steady force in the family, but lately, Jake had noticed a shift in her as well. There was a lightness in her step, a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there in months. She was no longer caught in the middle of the tension between her parents, and it seemed to have freed her in a way. She had her own dreams, her own space, and she was beginning to grow into the person she was always meant to be. Sarah, too, was changing. Her relationship with Jake had never been easy, but they were finding a new way to communicate. They weren't pretending that everything was perfect, but they had learned to understand each other in a way they hadn't in years. It wasn't just about being parents, it was about being partners again, sharing the weight of everything life had thrown at them. It was late evening when Liam came up to Jake on the porch. His face was thoughtful, a little hesitant, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He sat down next to his father, looking out at the fading light. "Dad," Liam began, his voice soft, "I've been thinking." Jake looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I know things aren't perfect," Liam continued, "but I want you to know that I'm really trying. I know I've made it hard on you, and I don't want to keep doing that. I just want to be a part of this, you know. I want to be a part of this family." Jake's chest tightened, but in a good way. He could hear the sincerity in his son's voice, the longing for connection that had been absent for so long. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. "I know you've been trying, Liam," Jake replied quietly, his voice full of warmth. "And I'm proud of you. I'm proud of how far you've come. We're not going to fix everything in one day, but we're on the right path. Together." Liam nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Dad. I think we can do this. We can get better." Jake smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "I know we can." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from pink to purple to dark blue. The world seemed to slow down around them, and Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had come so far. There was still work to be done, but the foundation had been laid. The worst was behind them, and the future, though uncertain, felt full of possibility. Sarah joined them on the porch a few minutes later, carrying a tray of lemonade. She handed Jake a glass and sat down beside him, wrapping her hand around her own. The family sat together in the soft twilight, the sound of the crickets and the gentle rustling of the leaves the only noise breaking the stillness. As they sat there, Jake realized that the true lesson in all of this wasn't about fixing everything or erasing the mistakes of the past. It was about understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to move forward. It was about love that wasn't perfect, but that was strong enough to endure, to heal, and to grow. It was a new beginning. A beginning that was messy, complicated, and imperfect. But it was theirs. And that was all that mattered. Jake looked at his family, his wife, his kids, and felt a deep sense of peace. They were together, not because they had it all figured out, but because they were willing to try. And that, Jake knew, was the most important thing of all. "Hey, let's make a deal," Jake said, breaking the silence. "We'll take things one day at a time. We won't have all the answers, but we'll always be there for each other. Deal?" Liam looked at him, then at Emily and Sarah. "Deal," he said with a grin. "Deal," Emily echoed, her voice light and carefree. Sarah smiled, nodding in agreement. "Deal." And with that, the family sat together in the fading light, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The road ahead was uncertain, but with love, hope, and the bond they had rebuilt, Jake knew they would be okay. Better than okay. They would be whole again. Together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?